The special session of the General Assembly that we're in right now was originally called to handle budget issues brought on by the COVID emergency. But the May killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer ensured that police reform would be on the agenda as well. And for many, there can be no police reform or even continuing on with the status quo without transparency. So these four panelists that we have next have been working to shine light on law enforcement for years. Supervisor Rodney Lusk has highlighted police data sets on a new section of the Fairfax County website, while Kim Rolla and Jasmine Leeward have both worked to pry loose valuable records that shine light on police disciplinary actions, use of force, and racial demographics of those the police interact with. And meanwhile, Rockett, a Richmond Times-Dispatch reporter, has been using FOIA to help inform her readers about police activity. And so, Supervisor Lusk, welcome.
Yes, thank you. I guess I can maybe kick off just giving a little bit of background on kind of why we created a separate website to house information on police data here in Fairfax County. So as you indicated, I think the impetus for a lot of this police reform was really connected to that George Floyd incident. But I'll also note we had an incident here in Fairfax County where we had one of our police officers get charged with assault of a resident who was having more of a behavioral health issue, no threat to themselves, no threat to others. And as a result of that, we got some feedback from the community. A number of our advocacy groups, and the principal ones being the NAACP, NOVA EAC, and ACLU People Power, brought forward a number of suggestions on how we could address making, our policing more compatible with our minority communities and really increasing the trust between the two. So of the recommendations, there was one that was really kind of consistently noted, and that is on the data and the sharing of data. So what you might not know is that I chair the Public Safety Committee for the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. So all of the police reform discussions and actions that the board will be taking at the committee level will come to the committee that I chair. So we've been really thinking about this issue of greater transparency and greater accountability with the police department in addressing policing in our community. And going back to this point about data being the thing that was repeatedly asked by these different groups, we noted that the county has provided data in previous years. So we had 2018 data use of force, and we had SRO data from 2018 and before, but we did not have any data as of about May, June of this year for our SROs, our use of force, and it became clear that we needed to make that available. So we reached out to the chief of police and were able to get him to start collecting and assembling that information. And what we realized following kind of that discussion that, okay, we're going to be able to get the data, is that data would have been placed on the police website, kind of embedded in that website. And we also noted that we have an independent police auditor in Fairfax County, and that information that he's responsible for on the use of force would have been embedded on his website. So we were kind of getting the sense that there's all these disparate places that this data would be residing, and it would make it harder for people to find it. And we made kind of a decision to try to aggregate that in one place, to make it easy for people to go to it and to find it, and to really put at the very top of the site those new data sets and that new data and information. So that was kind of the impetus for us creating this website, but we also had some other thoughts about how we could, collect recommendations from the community and have them reside on the website as well. So I believe there was a question that was presented that was, what are some of the obstacles that we have in launching this site? And I can say, there was no obstacles from the county standpoint. We had really good support from our public affairs department, our IT department. Once they understood what we were trying to accomplish, they all got, focused and centered around helping us create the template. And I can say that once that template was created, we were able to share it with the other members of the Board of Supervisors, and they pretty much all signed off on it. So the good news is it wasn't an issue for us to get this up and running. I know too that there was a question about, in terms of if there were other data sets that I might have interest in seeing. I think I mentioned the use of force. We have the SROs, the school resource officer use of force information also included. We have on the website information on traffic stops, citations, and other data affecting our minority members and others in our community. And what I would say would be extraordinarily helpful is we are in the process right now of trying to refine the data around use of force, because we can show what percentage of the population is impacted by use of force, but we don't have like multi-level, multivariate analysis of that use of force data. And I think that what we're proposing is to have the University of Texas at San Antonio help us kind of review this data and this information, and to give us a sense of, what are some of the drivers and the causes of the use of force, and then how can we address those disparities, give us some recommendations as well, and then to think through what types of data should we be collecting, and how should we be presenting that to the community. So I'm really looking forward to getting those results and making those available on the website. And that'll be sometime next year, probably in about the second quarter of 2021. Other data that we would love to see is some of the non-stops, looking at frisks, looking at searches that have consent, looking at searches that don't have consent. So we're going to continue to, push for additional information to be publicly made available to our community as well. In terms of a response, I'll say that we've had very strong positive response with regard to the website from those in the community. So our advocates, I think, appreciate having the transparency and the openness so that everyone can see the information, everyone can access it, people can be a part of helping us with what I'm calling our matrix. So our matrix is where we have developed a list of every recommendation, every question, and really pretty much every suggestion that we've received from members of our advocacy community, from our residents, and even from those in law enforcement. And what we believe is that this is important so that everyone can have kind of a voice in this process, and that we intend, and we're in the process of doing this, is we're going to have an answer for every single one of those recommendations, suggestions, or questions, and making that available again in that public domain. Additionally, we've done a number of town halls. So we've been getting out to the community virtually. So just as this meeting is a virtual meeting, we've done the same with our advocates, with our community associations, and with the police. I mean, we've recognized that they are a part of this equation in a way like no other, and that we need to be clear in hearing from them on any suggestions that they have to help us address how to make, policing better here in Fairfax County. And I'll say it's been kind of an interesting set of meetings with the police. So at the senior level in Fairfax, we have been doing police reform in the county for probably more than 7 years. And what that means is we already have a civilian review panel here in Fairfax County. We already have an independent public police officer who's an auditor for the police department. We have a community of trust group that's working to, establish better communication and better trust between our community and the police department. We have really been fortunate in that, we have a use of force policy that's already in existence. So there's a lot of things I want to say Fairfax County has done extraordinarily well, but I also concede and make the point that we can do things different and that we can make improvements as well. So we have over 200 recommendations on this matrix. From the standpoint of, again, the senior leadership in the police department, they are very open and recognize that change is something that, has to be done, and that they're, I think pretty much bought in to addressing the concerns that are coming forward. But when you get down to the line level, I think it's a different sort of position. There's some concern, and I'll give you an example. So if you're a school resource officer and there's a recommendation to remove school resource officers from all of the public schools in Fairfax County, there's a concern that not only will you lose your job, but there's a concern that that's going to cause some significant issues with regard to safety in the schools. Because many of these officers have established very strong relationships with the students, and the students are coming to them and sharing information on folks who might have guns, folks who might be in gangs. They're giving information that is helpful to address some of the criminality issues here in Fairfax County. So, we are, trying to figure this out, because I think, there's a balance, and making sure we understand as a community, where the roles of these school resource officers, and what is the direction that we want the school resource officers to go in the future. So this is a matter that will be decided by the school board. I guess maybe fortunately, say fortunately, because this is not an area that is in the purview of the Board of Supervisors, it's in the purview of the school board, but we will be working very closely with them, and we've had countless meetings now, many meetings, discussing the future of the SRO. And then the last point I'll make is, even for the line staff, there's some concern that they've raised as it relates to, the actions that departments are considering as it relates to addressing some of these disparities and the use of force against minorities, and some fear that, if they use force, they're going to get arrested and possibly thrown in jail, or they're going to end up losing their jobs. So, there's a lot of concern about the future, but I think, recognizing that this is a process, and we've got to continue to work with all of the participants and to engage them so that we can make the best decisions for the broader community. So with that, I will conclude my remarks.
Great. Thank you, Supervisor Lusk. Kim, Rolla, since George Floyd's killing, we've seen New York change its longstanding rule preventing access to disciplinary records, and you've been working to access those kinds of records here in Virginia. So what kind of data is available, and what new laws are being considered that might help?
Hey, Megan, thanks. Yeah, I think I want to back up a little bit and kind of talk how we, and I'm going to tag in with Jasmine Leeward, who's one of the panelists as well, because we've actually been working really closely together on this issue for like 3 years now, focused on local work in Richmond. And I think it's really helpful to have the context of the origin of this work. So I'll answer your question, really the narrow question, and then I want to kind of pull back. So the answer is that similar to about half the states in the US, there's no right of access to law enforcement disciplinary records in Virginia. It's what's called a discretionary exemption, which means the public body itself can determine that it doesn't want to release records. There's no category of records that you have a right to access. So there's pretty much a hard wall there unless the department itself decides to release records. And it's actually, it's an administrative investigation exemption. And they also will sometimes claim a personnel exemption as well. So there's a pretty easy way for them to just deny access to those records altogether. And as I'm sure Ali will speak on too, that's most certainly what they do when you ask for them, almost always. And you mentioned, Megan, a bit about what's going on in the General Assembly, and I will say that's one of the pieces of legislation we really hoped the General Assembly would take up, is like starting to pick away at that. We know law enforcement officers that harm Black and brown people disproportionately are folks that typically have a record of using inappropriate force. The officer that murdered George Floyd, I think, had 18 complaints that have been filed against him. There's just not a way for the public to know that in Virginia right now. And I think I saw Jasmine. Did you unmute yourself for a second?
Yeah, no, I was just saying hello since we were tackling this one together.
Awesome. So yeah, please interrupt me, but I was going to pull back for just a minute to say kind of the way that Jasmine and I got to know each other, I think is really actually connected to what I was just saying about the need for how this record access is just inextricably intertwined with accountability and the ability to actually have, for the community to have some power to hold law enforcement accountable for wrongdoing, and both systemic and individual wrongdoing. So the way Jasmine and I met each other was actually several community groups coming together in Richmond around a demand of civilian oversight for the Richmond Police Department. So this was in 2017, and I'll just spoiler alert, 3 years later, we won. There was an ordinance that passed this summer in July to create the 4th civilian oversight body. It actually created a task force to do deep community engagement around what that would look like. But what I will tell you is that was a very long fight, not just in years, but in amount of labor spent to build the power to do that. And one of the first things we had to do was actually convince elected officials and the public that there was a need for civilian oversight of our police department, that there were problems. There were racial disparities in use of force, racial disparities in complaints, racial disparities in patrols, which I think Jasmine's gonna talk a bit about. But really quick, I just wanted to give folks kind of the landscape of what we went through to try to convince people of that is, first, we really honestly believe, I know this is VCOG really focuses on public records. We also believe that the community holds data. We believe that stories are truth and that people know their experience. So one of the first things we did was door knocking. We did story collection and we shared those stories. And what we heard back from elected officials was, many different thematic variations of this isn't good data, right? That's anecdotal, those are bad apples, they should have filed a complaint, that was a long time ago. So I'm an attorney at Legal Aid Justice Center. And one of the things that I do as an attorney is write strongly worded letters. So I was pulled in kind of to attempt to provide some data scaffolding for these stories, to say it's not this one person. It wasn't just in 2002 when it happened to them. It's not just a bad apple, to kind of get a broader picture. So, very in a nutshell, what we went through and actually the first FOIA request, I looked it up because I was trying to remember. The first FOIA request I sent to RPD was in September of 2017, and we did not get some of the data we were seeking, we did not get until January of 2019. So we were seeking initially use of force information on civilian complaints against officers, and based on community feedback, we eventually expanded that to include some of the things that the supervisor was just talking about: pedestrian contact, traffic stops, and the kind of the standard flow that I've experienced from law enforcement officers with what happened here, or law enforcement agencies was, you know, they say you can't have the records themselves because there's discretionary exemptions that cover all of them. So that's kind of what I mentioned a little bit earlier. You know, it's a personnel record, it's an administrative investigation. Frequently, they'll also cite a criminal investigation exemption, which I know is something that is being taken up at the General Assembly session, kind of trying to narrow that, but saying, oh, use of force could potentially be criminally investigated. We can't give you any information on that. And then if you pivot and say, well, I don't necessarily need the actual like PD 35 or whatever the form you use to document use of force, I just want information on how many uses of force and like demographics and where they happened. Frequently the response would be, well, that would require manual data manipulation. And then, you know, one of two things: either they can cite, well, I don't have to create that record if it doesn't exist, I'm not gonna aggregate that for you. Or I could aggregate that for you, but it's gonna cost thousands and thousands of dollars, and I can't tell you exactly how many thousands of dollars, just that it's gonna cost a ton of money.
Yeah, Kim, if I can chime in too.
Yes.
I think one thing that one piece of the work that we did that coincides with this, where we tried to be proactive to prevent this sort of runaround with RPD, is really be proactive in their new records management system that they were looking to implement, so that we could on the front end be collaborative partners and design a system that made data access for public consumption easier, and to actually prevent over surveillance of communities as well. So that is some work we did in 2018 as well. As far as like, how do we actually design and approach the work in a way that allows us to not have to go through such a runaround.
Yeah, that's a really, and I should mention that part of the victory that we had, you know, we were able to get the Richmond Police Department to not only release use of force and civilian complaint data to us, and I think Megan included in the materials a report that we generated from that data called Our Streets, Our Say, that tried to, you know, put in infographics, easy to understand, because when we get this data, right, it's not easily digestible. It's, you know, it's pretty dense. So we tried to get that out in the community. And one of the things that we were able to, again, not from my strong letter writing, but from community power and actually pressuring political officials and the mayor, and having, you know, really, I think from power from the base, really getting the police department to commit to not just releasing that data to us, but to releasing it publicly on their website on a monthly basis, both use of force and civilian complaint data. Ali has done some amazing reporting from that, including highlighting when it is not accurate, when it frequently, which it frequently is. But it is there, at least, to Jasmine's point. It's hard to find, it's not user-friendly. And the traffic stop and pedestrian contact, which is what they don't differentiate between consensual stops consensual encounters and stops. So they're all together, but that's not released on an ongoing basis. That was a CD of data that I went and signed and picked up from the police department. It's not, you can't get that on an ongoing basis. And to the comment of the prior speaker as well, they've continued to assert that there's no ability to break down by the number of people who are searched as a result of a stop, the number of people who actually contraband is allegedly found when they search them. Like, we don't have that kind of granularity ever. They've never released that. So to Jasmine's point, we really have worked with the community to say, like, what kind of data does the community want? How can we actually get this to people in a meaningful way that doesn't have logistical barriers, financial barriers, and how do we make sure that doesn't come with surveillance? Again, surveillance of, we're really talking about in Richmond, like predominantly Black communities and predominantly Black and brown communities. So
yeah,
definitely we're bringing that intersection up.
Yeah, and if I can chime in again with one more intersection, one thing we found with the data that we did collect was the overlap between issues in the city. So again, the burden of proof often lies with the community. So this is kind of the environment we're working in. But we found that the same areas that we were identifying that were being over-policed, which were the affordable housing and public housing areas in Richmond, were also the areas with the highest eviction rates, with Richmond being in the top in the nation with evictions. So we see this over criminalization in the data that reflects the real experiences of folks in the community, clearly, of this targeted police force. And a lot of the data that we received was on truancy and again, the consensual stops were not really clearly identified, but there's great overlap with and intersections with the different issues that folks are fighting with that the police data often helped us to highlight and thread that needle together strongly.
And the last, and I know, Megan, you'll probably have some follow-ups, but the last kind of thread I wanted to loop back in is about kind of where we started this work. You know, as Jasmine and I mentioned, you know, it was for a civilian oversight body. And I think that this is really, and there are bills moving through the General Assembly right now to give localities greater power to create civilian oversight bodies. One of those is subpoena power, also, you know, disciplinary authority, final disciplinary authority over officers. But related to the subpoena power, I think it's a really interesting intersection because when we talked to community members about civilian oversight, they meant not just individual complaint resolution, which I think is important, right? We found in the data we looked at that only 20% of civilian complaints against officers are resolved in a timely manner. And that's completely unacceptable. And I meet with clients all the time who have an incident and they say, I'm not going to file a complaint because it's not going to matter. They're not going to meaningfully respond to it if they respond to it at all. And, you know, it's hard to talk back to that because we saw in the data, there were pretty serious like systemic issues with that process. So that's part of it, but we also heard from people that they wanted broader oversight, right? They want to know exactly what Jasmine was talking about. Like, why do I feel like my neighborhood is being occupied? Like, why am I stopped the number of times that I'm stopped when I'm driving in Southside or when I'm going home in the East End? Like, why is that happening? And one of the things I think is really important is that those civilian oversight bodies also have to have access to data, like not just necessarily subpoenaing officers to testify or like specific records in a case, but let's say they want the same kind of data that we were fighting for, right? Like they want to be able to have from the police department data on pedestrian encounters and searches and things like that. And there's a real question about where that data comes from, right? Right now, a lot of the civilian oversight bodies, they have to have MOUs, which are like memorandums of understanding, which, you know, it's not the best structure to have an oversight agency have to look at data at the pleasure of the agency that they're overseeing, right? That's not good. So, and then when we talk about subpoena power, I really worry that we'll get into situations where they may be released, certain information will be released, but subject to a protective order. And then if these bodies are supposed to be about accountability and openness, can they have open discussions about some of these things? And I recognize there are, you know, I understand there are certain HR or personnel issues, but I think like we really need to have serious, robust debate about what information is in the public sphere for these kinds of accountability mechanisms to work well. And, you know, it might not be, again, every piece of someone's personnel file, but it's just unacceptable for those to be a black box, especially in the historic moment we're in right now. Like we need that to change.
Yeah, and then one thing I wanted to add, Kim, to the process of actually filing police complaints. I remember, I'm not sure if it's been updated at this point, but especially for the folks who are undocumented or Spanish speaking, there was a disclaimer on RPD's website that said basically, if you file a complaint, then it's likely that, you know, that doesn't protect you from, you know, research being done to see if you're here legally. And that even disclaimer was in English. So, you know, it was also before we get to the data, the process to even file a complaint that's going to be reflected in the data was clearly kind of is built to deter people from filing complaints.
Allie, do you want to jump in here now in terms of what data you've been able to get, not just data, but also, you know, notably, there were some interactions between protesters and police that produced some contradictory messages from law enforcement, and how do you tease all that out?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Megan. I think one important thing that almost every speaker is talking about is the idea of this. I think Kenya said it, the FOIA ping pong that has to happen, of going back and forth, and the idea of like what is good data. And so I would say probably half of the stories that I've written out of data stories, not just from the Richmond Police Department, but I think they're an interesting case study in this, is literally pointing out why that data that I've gotten is bad, why it's inaccurate, the holes that are there, and things that I even point out to them and say, hey, this doesn't make sense. Like, can you explain that to me? And then them not really having an answer to it. And, you know, a lot of this, Kim kind of mentioned it, it goes back to them having to manually enter some of this data and provide it for the first time ever. And there's going to be inaccuracies and, you know, human error in that, but the idea that all of these encounters could be documented electronically to begin with at the point of I'm encountering an individual, I think is a really important thing to talk about. You know, New York's been, the New York City Police Department, which is extremely large, has been documenting stop and frisk data for years. And they even call it stop and frisk data. You know, the Richmond Police Department calls them consensual encounters, like Kim mentioned there. But that data can be tracked, and I think that that's important. And one of the issues that has arisen out of all of the recent civil unrest is that there's a lot of things that police can do versus what they should do. And so that's what a lot of my reporting has been surrounding, not only in just data transparency looking at, but just in interactions with the public, especially in these protests. You know, Kim and Jasmine have collected stories from individuals who have had encounters with police for years that have gone kind of unreported, you know, not only by myself, but just like media in general, but have gone without complaint to the police department because they don't think that the police department is going to do anything about these. But what the civil unrest has kind of brought to light is that these interactions are happening daily, and they're happening in a more public sphere now, that people are being videotaped and being recorded. I've been out at the protest occasionally and seen some of the interactions for myself. I saw a police SUV drive through a crowd of protesters. You know, I witnessed that myself. I was standing right there. I almost, you know, was in the middle of it myself. And so to see a press release come out the next day that said, you know, the SUV didn't run through the protesters, it was provoked, you know, all of these things was just like, well, I was a reporter witnessing it at that time, but I'm also, you know, standing there able to see it as a human being. So calling into question the police narrative, I think being there is important, but we're also able to see video. There was a recent incident of a bicyclist getting shoved over. The police department even described it as being tackled, but the guy was actually like pushed over. Police said he was fleeing. He may have been. It's like kind of unclear in the video. He was obstructing a tow truck from towing a car that basically initiated all of this interaction. That was apparently illegally parked at the jail during a protest, and the bicyclist moved after being told by police to move. A police officer approached him, he jumped on his bike, drove away, and then got pushed very aggressively to the ground, hit his head. The video is like kind of jarring to watch, and everyone that I spoke to was pretty jarred by seeing it. And you know, the next day I went to a press conference, asked the police, you know, what is this being investigated for use of force, excessive use of force? And the deputy police chief looked at me and said, what do you call excessive about that. And I think that highlights a lot of the issues that we're having is the data that Kim and Jasmine really collected. I piggybacked on their FOIA request to get that data, but without them, I don't think I would have been able to have gotten it myself without that public pressure. But that data is self-reported. It's self-reported by the officers who are doing the use of force, who are deciding whether or not to use force, deciding whether or not that use of force is in fact force. There's all of these different layers of how this gets reported. And some of those complaints can initiate from the public, but the use of force information that is online on the police department's website is officer reported. And I think that's really important. So what's not being reported is this incident at the jail going to be reported? I don't know yet. We'll find out the 1st of next month if it will be reported. And then on top of that, Kim kind of mentioned this, that there's been a task force that the mayor's created to kind of look at, he's calling it reimagine public safety. And I've covered that pretty heavily since I started meeting. And at the last meeting, which was last Friday, they talked about just now, it was September 4th, just now they were able to find that use of force data. So not only, it's a 40-member board with a liaison from the mayor's office, with active police officers on this 40-member board, and they couldn't even find their own data on their own website. And I think that highlights a really significant problem. And I didn't even understand that they had mentioned not being able to find the data, but I was like, I don't know what they're talking about. It's just on their website. So I didn't think anything of it until the last meeting when they said, oh, well, we just found this website. It was hidden, in the bottom of their website. So again, it highlights the issues of not only is the data, it might be available, but it's flawed, and it's not readily available on the website where people can find it. So all of that makes it a little tougher, not only to do my job to be able to inform the public about this, but just to even be able to synthesize the data myself and the information, and then match it up with what is actually being experienced by people on the street. And I think that that's kind of where the breakdown happens. Where those kind of two things intersect is really what my job is, to match that data with real life experience, and try to put a face to some of those incidences that we don't hear about every single day, that are happening every single day in the city of Richmond. And the police department, I think, has made a big promise of being transparent, and I think that they genuinely think that they're being transparent, but it's I think that public conversation of what actually is in the public sphere needs to still happen, and put some more public pressure on not just the Richmond Police Department, but all police departments in our area have a real issue with data transparency and the information that they give out.
Thanks, Allie, and I certainly want the panelists to be able to sort of spark off what a previous panelist has said, but did want to share this question from our audience that says, are you finding, in light of 2020 community actions, that there is more local political will to open up police department data? And if so, is that leading to local government action to make that data more available?
I will take this first. I don't know that it's opening up police department data publicly, but I think there are more people in government and on these task force that are being created that are asking for more data and want more data because they've realized that it's just not out there and it's not easy to find. So I do think that there is more will to get data, whether it's gonna be available or not. I don't know we can answer that. But I will say, I do think the political will there to actually have some civilian oversight has changed. And as Kim said, that the city has already started creating a civilian review board, which until earlier, just a few months ago, there was no political will to do that. The police department, the mayor, all have vehemently said that they oppose that type of oversight, any sort of outside oversight. The new police chief who came in, who was hired in the midst of all of this, comes from North Carolina, where they have much wider open records laws, which I hope is promising. But just in his taking over of the police department, we've seen less data. We're able to get less information about who is arrested, especially in these protests, where they're from, their ages, just the release of the names of people who are arrested, also victims of crimes. And part of that is maybe not for public consumption, but it helps us as reporters and folks who are trying to investigate these things to find these people, to get their stories and to know what really happened. And so we've already seen some doors shut in that regard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I would agree with Allie. I think that what I've observed is that the political will is actually coming from different areas. So like there's a certain level of political will at our city council level that is pressuring at the municipal level with the mayor. At the state level, we're seeing pressure from different politicians, and also it is an election year. And so I think that has a lot to do with what people are, the level at which people are willing to push at this moment. And so I have seen a huge change of heart where people are ready to talk about things that we've been talking about for 3 years vehemently. And that has been both encouraging and discouraging, I think. But the public consumption part is the real part that I think we need to dig in on, because there is this attempt of compromise that I think would not necessarily give as much, public access as we would like to see.
Yeah, I'll just add that as an elected official, I'm getting a lot more pushback from the advocates and from the community. So we are definitely hearing from those who put us in these positions, and they are requesting that we do something. I think the tipping point obviously is George Floyd, but then, as I mentioned earlier, in Fairfax County, we had our own specific incident here, and that brought to light a need to address this excessive use of force as well. So we are doing things differently, and I think the creation of the website indicates that. The Public Safety Committee that I chair, we are being as transparent, as open as we can with regard to, requests, recommendations, suggestions. And as I said earlier, we're going to go through each one of those. So there's no place to hide. And I think we are getting specific requests from different groups about what types of data we want to see. And I'm communicating, pretty much, not every day, but pretty regularly with our chief of police and our deputy county executive for public safety, that we've got to do better. And this issue on how we establish within our new police database kind of the data elements that we want to track and how we're going to present that information is critical and important. So I think this is a point that you were making earlier about influencing that process at that development of the software and the technology that's going to be used for the data collection, and then making sure that we have some input into what things we want to see coming out that analysis, and being able to disseminate that widely to the broader community. So I'm encouraged personally. I think we and I consider myself to be a public servant, and my wife hits me upside the head when I say this, but I don't always see myself as a politician, but I see myself as a public servant. So when there are issues I want to try to find a resolution to them, and that's what, you know, the focus and the responsibility that we have. And I believe that there are a lot of other politicians who are looking at their role and their responsibility in that way right now, because I don't think there's any place to hide. This issue is not going away, and I respect that people have been marching, people have, you know, gotten out and made their voices heard, and, you know, we've got to do better. This can't continue. So I'm very encouraged.
I wanted to add just two things. Like I agree with a lot of what's been said already. And I say this first thing, I just want to caveat that I believe data access is incredibly important. I wouldn't be doing the work I'm doing if I didn't think that. I wouldn't be on this panel. And also, I just want to lift up that the local demands that I'm hearing from people I'm working with are not for data access right now. They're for substantive shifts in power, because part of the reason that we asked for data was to build the political will to make substantive change, at least as far as the advocate community is concerned. And one of the things that I have heard repeatedly from my work, and I take this as a very legitimate pushback to say, I knew that already. Like, you spent 2 years getting that. I could have told you that. I told you that 2 years ago that was happening. And I think people understand why we still needed the data to do the work. But I just want to say, like, I don't, on a local level where people have built this power and are out in the streets right now, the primary demands that I'm hearing for folks are not more access to data. And it's really about, like, what will make substantive change in what we know is occurring. And then again, because I said I care about data, I do. And I think, like, the other thing I want to lift up is at the state level. I think that's a really important place these conversations are happening, right? The person who asked the question asked about whether there's local political will and how departments are responding. And frankly, I think some departments are responding more favorably to data access because that's more palatable to them than some of the other shifts that are being requested. But on the state level, just so folks know, like, there is very strong opposition that's happening behind the scenes to changes to FOIA law to give more access to law enforcement records. The various lobbying arms of law enforcement agencies, of chiefs, of officers, like they are pushing back on attempts to open this up. And I think that I just want people to be aware that, like, this is, and I think it was Jasmine already mentioned this, you know, this is a battle that's playing out on multiple fronts. And I do think for various reasons, you know, and I am sure many people on this webinar agree, you know, we need to be pushing for the state law to change at the same time as we're pushing to build power and mechanisms locally to pry limited data from people's hands. I think that's important. I think that power is important. I think those campaigns are important, but I also think that there are just structurally things that need to change in Virginia's FOIA law.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. I would also like to add to that. It's very true that we're also looking in that power shift, looking at the exorbitant amount of resources that, especially at the city level, the budget of RPD takes up, and how we can start to build systems with the police being overwhelmed with jobs that are not in their job description. How can those jobs be allocated to other individuals and other systems? And what I'm also seeing a dynamic play out of how political will at the state level is actually creating political hesitation at the local level and producing more excuses of, okay, we might need to just calm down and wait until we see what the state does so that we don't have to rearrange things. But there are specific, I think, routes of doing that transfer of power that can take place even at the municipal level when it comes to budgets, because especially in Richmond, the police department is the #1 budget item in our city. And so I think when we talk about the importance of data, even in our first reach for data, it was because that was the burden of proof that we were required to supply if we wanted to advocate for a civilian oversight body. So that is really, that need for the transfer of power is actually what led to our push for data collection in the first place. So thank you for bringing that up, Kim.
Yeah, and I definitely agree that I think the push has been for the substantive change and not, or, you know, structural change and maybe not the data side of it. And I will say, you know, the data goes both ways. I think the a constant refrain that I've heard from the police department is, oh, and it shows in their data, they've had less complaints made for use of force this year than last year. And that's because people aren't complaining because the process isn't transparent. It's not that those complaints don't exist, it's that they're not being made to the police department. So I think that if those channels were opened up more, we would have, I think, even better data to go back on. But I think the idea that needing the data is so important, but also pointing out where the data is bad, I think is even more important. And I hope that goes to formulating some of the changes in state law that open up FOIA and open up records laws, so that we can know when the data that we're getting is inaccurate. And one way that I'll say, one specific way that I think this is really pertinent is, the police departments track their homicides, but they have a very narrow definition of what a homicide is. A homicide is not when a police officer shoots and kills somebody. It's not when a person shoots and kills another person out of self-defense. Those things aren't collected and aren't tracked in the same way. So, the Richmond Police Department often has a much lower homicide rate than what I report in the paper. And so I have to point out every time that I say that, here's what the police says, here's what, how many homicides have actually happened in the city. And I think until those two things meet, there's always going to be this resistance. And I think that that's an important part of the data conversation, is that we all need to come to an understanding of what data is and be specific in our language about what we're describing in that data, because it might not be the same language and use that the police department is using or the general public is used to hearing what that is. So again, that's another part of my reporting, is that I always have to explain exactly what use of force is and what homicide is, and the definitions and how they vary in layman's terms and what they mean in police terms. And so I think until those things can kind of come together, I think the data is just always going to be flawed. But that's not to say we don't want it. It's still informing. It's just informing in a different way.
Well, actually, so Allie, can I chime in here? Is that, and I've seen this from a couple of police departments, Norfolk in particular, is the notion that it's related to what you're saying, is we can't or we shouldn't release data because the public won't understand it. Yeah. And I'm wondering how that's can be overcome. And Supervisor Lusk, is that something that that was of concern for you when you're releasing, doing the website?
Yeah, I think that's an important part of why police departments need, every police department in our area has a public information officer, and it's those people's job. The Richmond Police Department has 4. Chesterfield has one public information officer who's I think one of the best in the business. Henrico has 2-ish. And they're actual police officers who do that role. So it's their job to make the information coming out of the police department palatable for the public. And if they're not doing a good job at that, I, kind of question what they're there to do, what role they are. They are spokespeople for the police department, which means that they are going to put that narrative first and foremost. And I think that I say this all the time to the police departments that I cover. I say, use me. I am a resource to you. I am a way to get this information out to the public in a way that they will understand it. But you have to answer the questions that I have, because otherwise I'm not going to be able to educate the public. And I don't know that I've ever heard a police department locally say that they don't want to release it because the public won't understand it. But I do think that is a fear that they want to kind of hold on to that message and it be their message to get out rather than letting it kind of, the chips fall where they may. And so I think that is a fear that they have. But I think the more transparent you are about that, the less likely people are likely to misunderstand what the data is saying. And you know, that's kind of my job as a reporter, is that I ask those questions, make it understandable, but also point out when it's wrong and when it's inaccurate. And I had a conversation with a PIO about the use of force data. I was doing a story about it not being released in the midst of all of this kind of chaos for 2 months. They did not release the data. They released on the 1st of every month. And for 2 months it went unreleased. And so I was writing a story about that. A day or 2 days before my story ran, they decided to release it. So I started asking questions about why certain incidences from the civil unrest where we knew use of force was being used. You know, the city publicly came out and said, we tear gassed a crowd of unsuspecting protesters accidentally. We're sorry for that. And that specific incident was not included in that data when it was released. So I rewrote my story to say they've released the data, but now it's, you know, it has these flaws in it. And so then they updated the data. And this is all in the process of me writing my story. It hadn't come out yet. And so I then had to rewrite my story a third time to update that, but still pointing out the flaws of why this data was not complete. And so again, I think, and I had this conversation with the PIO. I said, I understand this is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, but no data is, in this case, is maybe better than bad data. Like, make sure your ducks are in a row and release it and give it to us in a full sphere, because otherwise we're just getting half of the information or part of the information.
Yeah, I'll piggyback here and say I believe transparency is key. And in Fairfax, we're trying to push out as much data as we can. But I think I made this point earlier. We are undertaking a study on our use of force data for the last 3 years of reported data, 2016, 17, and 18. University of Texas is going to be analyzing that data. And I think what's important is that we got to figure out how to look at this in multiple variant ways, because I think if you just look at it from a race and ethnicity standpoint, it doesn't tell you why it's happening. I think we've got to get to that next level, and that requires additional kind of analysis and awareness of how to do statistical modeling. And I think that's where you've got to get to people who, you know, have tremendous experience doing this. So for us, we are employing them to help us interpret those years. And then what they're also going to do is help us with our data collection going forward, give us a kind of a template on these are the types of variables that you need to be, you know, collecting information on, and this is how you should report it. But we've got to be clear that we're in agreement in terms of the model that they're going to be providing, because that's what we're going to be releasing to the public. And I would say, you know, with our school resource officers, and this is probably no surprise to anyone here on this video conference, we have a disproportionality of use of force in our schools with kids that are Black and brown. And it's the same use of force in Fairfax County, Black and brown. So, but then the question is why, right? So why is that happening? And we've got to get to that next place and then try to interpret how we can make the change. So the last point I'll make on policy is, and I think, Allie, you might have been sort of alluding to this, we were looking at kind of this issue with the police. There's so many things they get called on to do. When you call the 911 dispatch, they send out police, they send out fire and rescue, or they might in some cases send out a team of people who have some behavioral health experience, but that's not always the case. What we've asked in Fairfax County, recognizing that there are models across the country, and I'm sure, Ali, you're familiar with this, but the Cahoots model in Oregon and Eugene, exemplary, impressive. Denver has a STAR model. We've asked in Fairfax County, can we look to take away from the police at the 911 dispatch level some of these behavioral health issues, mental health, substance abuse, that have no criminality. So you're not sending a person out with a gun and trying to have that handled. Then you don't risk the issue of having them use force on someone that has a mental health issue or has a substance abuse issue. So we are going to be testing this out over the next year or so. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to see kind of a reduction in the number of calls that go to the police as a result of it. And then to the point of, if there are ways for us to reallocate funding, there could be the potential to do that as well as a result of not having the police go out on so many calls. So I think, you know, again, there's so many really good recommendations that are coming forward through this process, and we've got an opportunity to make some significant changes to really improve the way law enforcement interacts with our minority community and those that have, you know, disabilities and other issues, because you know, there's a heightened awareness and there are more people paying attention now, I think, than ever before. So I'm encouraged by this and look forward to seeing the changes that will be coming soon.
Yeah, I want to add that again, like, I feel like the heightened awareness is not necessarily due to an increase in police violence, but just an increase in the visibility of it.
Yeah.
And also when we talk about the one thing that's been important for me as I ask myself the question is, why are police departments resistant to producing this data? It's because the data is often, almost always, damning on behalf of the police department because of the amount of harm that they cause. So I think that's really important to keep in mind when we think about this struggle, right? It's not just because they don't want to give it up, it's because what that data would mean and what that data would reflect about the core values of an institution that's supposed to serve and protect. So I think that's really kind of the basis for understanding that this is going to be a struggle and a fight to access this data and to make the changes we need to keep communities safer, because of the level of harm that's consistently been caused by the police department and the increase of power that they've had since the 80s.
Well, I'm going to have to leave it at that. We're at our time limit now. I really want to thank all of you for taking the time to come and share your experience and insights with us. And we're going to move on to our next panel here in just a few minutes. So thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.